Okay, it's pretty hazy here in Deerfield Beach, so this might be a good time to talk about solar panels and what they can do in suboptimal weather. Although, since we're not actually in Deerfield Beach, we're on the other side of Florida on the Gulf Coast, but we have hazy weather here, so we'll just have to do our test here. And I'm just going to kind of tease some of the stuff we're going to talk about. So here's one of two solar panels I bought, and that's my old solar panel. Here's that Gendome Go 300 with a nightlight hooked up to its AC inverter. And we've got its crappy little tiny wall wart hooked up down there. And then we have a beefier Anker DC power supply here that we're going to try. And then we also have the Blueitti that we reviewed earlier with the same nightlight hooked up to it. Okay, so let's start with the boring stuff now that I teased you with this. Okay, so these are the panels I bought. This is $125 for two panels. That really is pretty incredible. These are N-Type panels, which give you a little bit better efficiency, more like 25% instead of in the low 20s. If we scroll down, it's kind of hard to find this. It's pretty important to know what not just the power output, but also the voltage. These are 23 volts each. And okay, this is where it gets kind of confusing. The power centers themselves really are not that confusing, but as soon as you talk about solar panels, it's confusing. And I'm still confused, so I'm probably not going to do the best job of describing this, but I'm going to try. So remember, again, we're talking about 23 volts here from just one of these 100-watt panels. And so here's where we have to talk about series versus parallel connection. So this shows a in-series connection, and this is kind of like what you have with a flashlight where you're putting the batteries in and they're just kind of going into a tube such that the plus of one battery is touching the minus butt end of another battery. And so you just look at the voltage on all the batteries and add them up to see what the total voltage is when you're connecting in series. So solar panels are the same way. If you want to connect solar panels in series, then you would connect the minus to plus, and then in the output you still end up with plus and minus. And we'll talk about connectors here in a minute, which are equally confusing. But first, let's talk about the parallel configuration. So with parallel, normally you wouldn't have a flashlight that you can put batteries in parallel, but you can do it with solar panels. And what we see here is pretty obvious. We just have the pluses connected to the pluses and the minuses connected to the minuses, and we still have at the end of the line, we've got a plus minus output. So, okay, so what's the difference? Well, if you connect panels in series, like we have here, like I said before, you're going to get voltage or additive voltage. And that's kind of a good thing because you want high voltage for long distances. So if you have a solar farm, maybe, that allows you to kind of cover long distances between panels and from the panels back to your power center without losing power. You can make up for this, but you have to get really thick wire to do that. The problem is that you have to watch out for the input capacity on your solar panel. So let's see, I think I have, we just talked about this, I think. 23 volts on these particular panels. And so that's going to be 46 output, and I might have lost this now. Let's see. I'll just tell you that I believe this guy tops out at 40 volts. Maybe I've still got it over here in a manual somewhere. Oh no, this is for the solar panel. Okay, see, I'm already getting myself confused. Anyway, just add up your voltage, look at the owner's manual for your power center, and see if you can even connect it in series, because you might not be able to. Oh, you know what? I know where it is. I've got it right here. Okay, so this is for the Gendome. Notice it's 30 volts actually, so 46 volts is going to be over. And they kind of have, oh yeah, let's look at this just for fun. So they're showing, we might as well jump to talk about connectors here in a second. Let's first, before we do that, finish out this somewhat already discombobulated discussion about series versus parallel. So the advantage of series, as we just said, is it increases the voltage, so you can do longer wire runs. A disadvantage, and again, this is what we were looking at before, series, where minus is connected to plus, minus, plus, minus, plus. A disadvantage of this is if one of the panels is shaded, then the least common denominator of all the panels is the voltage that you get. So that's not good. Okay, so now let's go down to parallel. Parallel doesn't have that problem, and also you get more amperage if you use parallel, but the voltage stays the same. So maybe parallel wouldn't be ideal for long runs. I would suggest Googling this to learn more about the difference, because there's a lot to understand. Okay, so let's jump to connectors. So I guess I should show you, before we look at connectors on the power centers themselves, since we just talked about the parallel and series type of configurations, let's look at the connectors that are on the solar panels. So all of these things are different. All right, so here's the newer solar panel here, and notice how the way this connector works, it seems awkward and weird that the wires are separate, but they need to be separate, obviously, so you can choose series or parallel configuration when you're connecting multiple panels, right? So then, okay, what happens when you're actually going to your power center? Well, you end up with a barrel connector like this, and there's a larger size connector and a smaller one. The larger one is generally only used for input, and so this Go 300 does have an input for this type of larger barrel connector. And if we look on this cloudy day, a little while ago we were actually getting 3 watts, but I think the sun has moved up to the point where the panel is, the sun was weak to begin with, and now the panel is shaded, so we're not really getting anything there. So the other type of connector that you will see on the power center side is an XT60 connector. And here's my old smaller, I believe this is a 50 watt solar panel. It's got the smaller barrel type connector coming off of it, and it does not have these standard type solar panel connectors, meaning it can't be connected to another solar panel. So this, personally, I kind of prefer this XT60, because you don't get into this confusing situation of, hey, did I remember to go into the app and set this barrel connector, which can be either input or output, appropriately? Because if you're sending voltage into a connector configured for output, that could be a bad thing. So XT60 is only used for output from the solar panel and then going in to your power center. The Go 300 doesn't have an XT60 input. This this smaller Anker Lantern power center does have XT60, which is nice. I believe you can also do USB-C input on that one. The Blueitti Elite 100 V2 has XT60, and I think they just avoided the whole problem of accidentally having the wrong input-output setting on any of their ports, unless I'm mistaken, even the USB-C ports, they're all output. They're not input. So, and then these are notice these small barrel connectors here. So that's the same smaller barrel connector that we have coming off of this solar panel. It's not the bigger barrel connector, which can be either input or output, that we see on the Go 300. And notice these are output only. These small connectors here are output only. So I think I have a page here that we can kind of review this. I specifically Googled solar input types on power centers, because otherwise you're going to get a bunch of confusing hits about the connectors coming off of the solar panel itself, or to connect solar panels together. So at the top, the XT60 is that one that's always has the kind of yellow connector and input, and that's the one I kind of like. And then we have the DC barrel plug, the 7909. That's the bigger one that's on the Go 300 over there. And we have, I don't know what the Anderson power pole is. Then we have the DC 5521. That's these smaller guys here that are being used as output only from the power center, or this is the same smaller barrel connector coming off of this panel. Okay, so I guess that's all there is to say about connectors. Let's talk about what is left to talk about. I want to say something about this Go 300 versus the Blueitti for UPS use. I was hoping maybe before we get to that, let's talk about just in general limitations of this thing. It is a really nice unit, and the app is just incredibly well done. It's really polished, and the functionality is logical. I really like it a lot. But there are a couple of things that you should know. One is this little rated at 35 watts power brick is incredibly lame. I forget when I discharged this down to 0, it was going to take like, I don't know, 12 hours or something for it to charge from that power brick, and the brick was getting quite warm. So let's just try, since we're getting nada input from our solar panel, from our 100 watt solar panel here, let's take this little power brick, and this is again another input or output port, and this is the one you have to use with the provided power brick if you want to charge from the grid. So let's plug that in. And now we should see our input jump up. And at first it peaks kind of high, but that's only a 35 watt little brick there. So, oh, and notice the fan is spinning, so the fan came on. In my experience, this quickly drops to 30, not even 35 watts of input. It's taking a little longer, so we won't wait for it to do that, but it usually happens quite quickly. So let's try instead this beefier Anker power center, which I recommend. It's great. It's got these little retractable USB-C connectors, and it's got AC outlets on the back, and it's 100 watts. So, okay, so let's unplug the smaller brick, and we'll plug in the Anker one. Sorry, I don't have a helper to hold my camera. Okay, see, now we're jumping up, not fully to 100, but to 95 watts of input. All right, so let's talk about using this as a power center. As a UPS specifically, as opposed to a power center. So some of the bigger power centers, or maybe better ones that haven't cut corners as much, advertise themselves as being usable as a UPS. And you might think, well, of course this is a UPS, right? Because if we unhook all the inputs, then we're still going to have power to this night light that's plugged into the AC inverter port. But really what's happening is we're just always drawing from the battery. So it's not actually sort of, I guess maybe the right way to put this is that if you've got a true UPS, it's bridging the AC input to the AC output as long as you have AC power. It's kind of just short-circuiting it and avoiding the, I shouldn't say short circuit in this context because that would be bad, but it's bypassing the battery as far as I can tell, and I'll show this on the Blueitti in a second. But this really isn't bypassing the battery, so let's first, even though it's doing nothing anyway, let's unplug the input we're getting from our solar panel. So of course we're still at a little over 90 up to 95 input. Now listen carefully. When I unplug this, you don't really hear anything, and there's no kind of flickering or anything of our night light. So now we have 0 power input, and the night light draws so little that it doesn't even show any output, but it's obviously drawing something. And it stayed on steady, but we heard no click of a relay like you would with the UPS. Okay, oh, and I guess I should say before I show that click on the Blueitti, the problem with this is that the battery is actually being steadily discharged and charged sort of at the same time. And it's kind of hard to find more information about this when you Google it, but I believe this means that the battery is, gradually being worn down a little bit because it's kind of constantly charging and discharging. And the other issue with it is that, for example, if I plug this into my TV and, my whole stack of TV and lamp and other things, then there's more power going out than there is coming in, especially when I'm using this little power brick. And oh, and by the way, this thing has so little, draws so little power that it's actually, I have in the very nice app, you can configure the inverter to automatically shut off if it hasn't detected power output for a while, which is great because if you just leave the inverter on with nothing connected to it, eventually you're going to drain your battery unwittingly. So I actually have to turn on the inverter again, which is for the AC outlet, to get this to come back on. Anyway, where was I? The issue is not only that you're kind of wearing the battery down, but it's not bypassing the battery. So let's say you're using it as a UPS and the power situation is fine. The power hasn't gone off. This thing will eventually shut off, as I discovered, because you're drawing, especially with this little guy with only 30 watts coming in. If you've got a stack of stuff that's 50 watts, then your input is lower than your output, and it's making up for that in the battery. So if it were simply bypassing the battery, as long as there's AC input, then that wouldn't be an issue. You could leave this thing in the circuit and it would never shut down because it's not being drained gradually. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so just to show what a proper UPS does. So here we kind of have the same thing. Let's light up the display. It says we have 0 input, but that's because it's fully charged. And it also shows 0 output, although it hasn't been, I think by default, this is not set to automatically shut down the inverter if it doesn't detect enough output. I haven't even checked the app on this one, so who knows? I assume I can configure that. Anyway, let's unplug this, and I think we did this in the Blueitti video originally, but listen to the sound that you hear when we do this. I'll just make contact. There's also a bit of a flicker there. So that tells you there's a relay in there to I believe, to bypass the battery. So you're not wearing the battery down by slowly charging or by charging and discharging it at the same time. But more importantly, if your output exceeds the rate of your input when you're using it as a UPS, it doesn't mean that the battery is gradually draining and the whole thing will eventually shut down, because you're really just basically the input coming from this grid into the power center is going straight to these sockets, bypassing the battery. So not to put too fine a point on it, but this thing is capable, and so is this, of delivering more wattage than the rate at which it can be charged. So it just means that unless you're bypassing the battery as a true UPS would when there's no power outage, you are eventually going to not have any battery left, because the wattage that's going out is just exceeding what this thing can internally supply from its battery. Okay, sorry that was long. Thanks for watching.